Fishing at night had always been one of my favorite things to do. There was something about the stillness of the water, the sound of crickets and frogs, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface that made it peaceful. My friend, Jake, and I had been planning a night fishing trip for weeks. The spot we picked was a small, secluded lake deep in the woods. One of those places you only find if someone tells you about it. No marked trails, no boat ramps, just a dirt road that turned into a narrow path leading to a stretch of shoreline with enough space to launch a small boat. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting behind the tree line. The lake was completely still, a sheet of dark green reflecting the dimming sky. There was no one else around, just the two of us and the sound of the woods settling into the night. We pulled our John boat out of the truck bed, loaded up our gear, and pushed off into the water. The plan was simple: find a good spot, drop anchor, and fish until we either ran out of bait or got too tired to keep going. We had everything we needed: tackle boxes, extra line, a couple of headlamps, and a small cooler filled with drinks and sandwiches. The boat had no motor, just a pair of paddles, but on a lake this small, that was more than enough. As we paddled out, the sky faded from deep blue to black. The stars were out, clear and bright above the tree line, and the temperature had dropped just enough to make the night feel crisp. We picked a spot about 50 yards from shore, near a fallen tree where the water was deeper. We set up our rods, cast our lines, and settled in. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional plop of a fish jumping somewhere in the distance. The only light came from our headlamps, which we kept off most of the time to let our eyes adjust. It was perfect. For a couple of hours, we caught a few decent fish. Nothing huge, but enough to keep us engaged. Every now and then, we'd hear something rustling in the woods along the shore, but that was normal. Raccoons, deer, maybe a coyote, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, around midnight, I noticed something strange. Across the lake, maybe 100 yards away, I saw a small, dark shape floating on the water. At first, I thought it was just a log, but then I realized it was moving slowly, almost too slowly for the slight breeze that was pushing across the lake. "Jake," I whispered, nudging him with my elbow. He looked up from his rod. "What?" I pointed. "That over there. You see that?" He squinted in the dark. "Looks like a boat." "Yeah, but no lights, no noise." We watched it for a few minutes. It didn't seem to be drifting naturally, and it wasn't paddling. It was just there. "Maybe someone else is out here," Jake said. "Then why aren't they using a light?" He didn't have an answer. We sat in silence, watching. After a while, it looked like the boat had stopped moving completely. It was just a black shape against the darker water. Something about it made my skin crawl. "Think we should call out?" I asked. Jake shook his head. "If they wanted to talk, they'd have said something by now." That was true. Most fishermen are friendly enough. If someone else had been out here, they would have at least flashed a light or said hello when we launched. This person, if there even was a person, hadn't made a sound. The air felt colder. We tried to go back to fishing, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting back to that dark shape, half expecting it to suddenly start moving toward us. But it never did. It just sat there. Then, around 1 a.m., something changed. There was a splash. Not a small one, not like a fish jumping. This was big, like something heavy had been dropped into the water. It came from the direction of the boat. We both snapped our heads toward the sound, but we couldn't see anything. "Did something fall in?" Jake whispered. "Maybe." I scanned the water with my headlamp. The boat was still there, unmoving. No ripples, no sign of whatever had made the noise. The lake was calm again. We sat there, barely breathing. Then, another splash, this time closer. My heart started pounding. I turned my headlamp back on, sweeping the beam across the water. Jake did the same. The boat was still there, but something felt wrong. The splashes had been too loud, too deliberate. "Maybe we should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah." We reeled in our lines as quietly as we could. I grabbed the paddles and started rowing, keeping one eye on the dark shape across the water. The lake felt different now. The peaceful stillness was gone, replaced by something else. Something heavy, like the air was pressing down on us. As we moved, I risked one last glance at the boat, and then I saw it. A pale shape, just barely visible above the edge of the boat. A face, not moving, just watching. I froze. "Jake!" He followed my gaze, and then he saw it too. Neither of us spoke. We just kept paddling. Faster. The shore felt like it was miles away. I didn't look back again. I didn't want to see if the face had moved, if the boat was following us. I just paddled, heart pounding, breath shaking. When we finally reached land, we didn't stop to pack up our gear. We just grabbed what we could, hauled the boat onto the shore, and ran for the truck. We didn't talk until we were speeding down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the trees. "What the hell was that?" Jake finally whispered. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. We never went back to that lake. Fishing was my escape. No noise, no stress. Just the rhythm of the cast, the quiet hum of insects, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. It was late summer when I drove out to a remote lake about 2 hours from town, a place I'd been visiting since my teenage years. Hardly anyone came out this far, which made it perfect. The old wooden pier at the south end of the lake was my go-to spot. It was rickety, half-rotted in places, but it stretched just far enough into the water to reach the deeper sections where the big ones lurked. The lake itself had a reputation, whispers of drownings, a few old missing persons cases, but I never paid them much mind. People got careless around water, that was all. That evening, the air was thick with humidity. The water lay still, like a sheet of black glass reflecting the bruised colors of the sky. I set up my gear quickly, threading my line, baiting the hook with night crawlers. A few minutes later, my bobber was gently rocking in the water, and I settled into my usual routine. Cast, wait, reel, repeat. It was just past twilight when I hooked something heavy. At first, I thought I'd snagged on a submerged log, whatever was barely moved when I pulled. I gave the rod a sharp tug to free it, but it held firm. Then, to my surprise, it started rising. Slowly, the surface of the water bulged outward as the thing beneath it came up. My first clear glimpse sent ice through my veins. A pale shape broke the water, a human hand, bloated and swollen. For a few stunned seconds, I didn't react. The hand was limp, fingers curled slightly inward, the skin an unnatural shade of gray, waterlogged, rotting. I saw the wrist, tangled in weeds, the tattered remnants of a sleeve floating beside it. The fingers bobbed with the movement of the water, as if waving. Then my mind caught up. I dropped the rod. The hand sank, vanishing into the dark water. My fishing line trailed after it, disappearing into the lake's depths. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to believe my eyes had played tricks on me, that I had seen something else, but I knew better. My body finally kicked into action. I grabbed the rod and started reeling as fast as I could. The line pulled tight, resisting for a second, then suddenly went slack. I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the dock. When I lifted the hook from the water, the bait was gone. I stood there, breathing hard, my mind racing. I had to go to the police. Someone was in the water, a body. Someone drowned. But when? How long had it been down there? I turned, ready to leave, when something splashed behind me. It wasn't the casual ripple of a fish surfacing or the quiet lap of water against the pier. This was a deliberate movement, a sound that carried weight. I turned back, heart hammering. The lake was still, perfectly smooth. Then, a few feet from where I had been fishing, bubbles rose to the surface. A slow, steady stream. I took a step back, then another. The old wooden planks creaked beneath me. Something moved beneath the water. I couldn't see it clearly, just a vague shadow shifting in the depths. The bubbles continued, rising, closer. Then, without warning, something brushed against one of the dock supports beneath me. A heavy, scraping impact. The whole pier shuddered. That was enough. I grabbed my tackle box, shoved everything inside without care, and sprinted off the dock. My truck was parked about 100 yards away, half hidden by trees. The night had grown darker, the woods unnervingly silent. My boots crunched against the gravel as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, nearly dropping them twice before finally getting the door open. I threw myself inside and locked it immediately. I sat there, panting, staring out at the lake through my windshield. The dock was barely visible now, just a silhouette against the dark water. Everything was still, but I wasn't fooled. I started the engine and peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't slow down until I was well past the main road, miles from the lake. I reported what I saw to the local authorities the next morning. A sheriff's deputy took my statement, scribbling notes as I described everything: the hand, the fishing line, the bubbles. They sent out a search team later that day. I didn't go back. Couldn't. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff's department. The officer on the other end sounded tired. "We didn't find anything," he said. I didn't believe him. They searched the lake for 2 days, dragged the water, sent divers down. Nothing. No body. No remains. No sign of anything unusual. "Are you sure?" I asked, gripping the phone. "There was no hand, son," the deputy said, "and no missing persons reported recently. Maybe you saw something else in the dark." I wanted to argue, to insist, but what could I say? I knew what I saw. The lake was deep. It had caves, old logs, places where something or someone could disappear forever. Maybe they hadn't searched the right spot. Maybe the body had sunk again, dragged further into the abyss by whatever had been holding it there. Or maybe it had never wanted to be found. I haven't gone fishing since. Fishing has always been my escape. There's something about the quiet ripple of water, the rhythmic cast of the line, and the sheer patience of the sport that clears my mind. So when my friends suggested a weekend fishing trip at a remote lake, I didn't hesitate. There were 4 of us: me, Chris, Mark, and Dylan. We had all fished together before, but this time we wanted something different. We picked a lake deep in the national forest, a place miles from any main road, completely isolated. The only way in was a rough dirt trail, and the only way out was the same. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for days. Chris had found it online, a forgotten fishing spot that supposedly held massive trout. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. It sounded perfect. We packed up our gear, tents, coolers, bait, rods, and set out on Friday afternoon, excited for a weekend of nothing but fishing and relaxation. The drive was long. The last stretch nothing but a single-lane dirt road winding through thick forest. It felt like we were driving into another world, where cell phones were useless and the only sounds were birds, insects, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was setting. It was beautiful, calm, untouched, with trees lining the shore and no signs of human activity. We parked, unloaded our gear, and got to work setting up camp. We built our tents a few yards from the water, close enough to hear the gentle lapping of the lake. Chris got a fire going while Mark and I set up the rods. Dylan unpacked the food and beers. Everything was perfect. That first evening, we sat around the fire, eating grilled fish and talking about nothing in particular. The night was cool, the stars bright, and the silence was peaceful. Then, around midnight, we heard it. A splash. Not the small, rhythmic splashes of fish breaking the surface. This was different, heavier, deliberate, like someone stepping into the water. We all turned toward the lake. Probably just a deer, Chris said, shrugging. I wasn't so sure. It had sounded too distinct, too human. But I let it go. We were in the middle of nowhere. Who else would be here? The rest of the night passed without incident, though I found myself waking up a few times, convinced I had heard something moving outside my tent. Morning came, and we shook off the previous night's unease. The day was perfect. Cool air, clear skies, and plenty of fish biting. We spent the entire day on the water, paddling out in our small inflatable boat, catching more trout than we knew what to do with. By evening, we were exhausted. We cleaned the fish, cooked dinner, and settled in for another night by the fire. That's when we heard it again. A splash. This time, we were ready. Chris grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the lake. Nothing, but the water was still rippling, as if something had just moved through it. Mark laughed. All right. Which one of you is messing with us? No one answered. We sat there in silence, listening. The forest around us was quiet, too quiet. The usual night sounds, crickets, distant owls, had stopped. Then we saw it. A figure, standing waist-deep in the lake, motionless. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing our campfire. Chris, still holding the flashlight, aimed it directly at the figure. Nothing. The beam illuminated the water, but the figure seemed wrong. It had no detail.
No reflection.
No features. Hello, Dylan called out. His voice sounded too loud in the silence. No response. I felt a deep, instinctual fear rise in my chest. Something about this wasn't right. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone. The water was still. No ripples. No sign that anything had been there at all. Mark stood up. Nope, I'm done. What the hell was that? None of us had an answer. We tried to shake it off, convincing ourselves it was some kind of trick of the light. Maybe our tired eyes had played tricks on us. Maybe it had been a submerged log, floating weirdly. But deep down, none of us believed that. We decided to turn in early. The fire burned low as we climbed into our tents, each of us pretending we weren't scared. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened. The night was dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside the tents. I held my breath. They circled our campsite, moving between the tents, pausing, then continuing. Then, a sound that chilled me to my core, breathing. Deep, steady breathing. It was right outside my tent. I wanted to call out to the others, but fear kept me frozen. I gripped the knife I kept in my pack, barely daring to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I crawled out of my tent, heart still pounding. Chris and Mark were already up, pale and shaken. You heard it too, I said. They nodded. Dylan emerged a moment later, looking just as bad. We're leaving. Now. No one argued. We packed up in record time, stuffing our gear into the truck without bothering to organize it. The entire time I felt watched. As we pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the lake. For just a moment, I saw it again, standing at the water's edge, watching. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. We never spoke about it again, and we never went back. Fishing has always been my escape. No emails, no traffic, no noise. Just me, the water, and the quiet pull of a line. That's why I chose to paddle down the river that weekend. It was early September, the heat of summer starting to fade, but the water was still warm, the fish still biting. I had planned for a 2-day trip, packing my gear into a sturdy canoe and launching from a remote access point. The river was slow-moving, winding through dense forests with only the occasional clearing. It was one of those places where you could go hours without seeing another person, and that was exactly what I wanted. The first few hours were peaceful. The sun filtered through the trees, dappling the water in gold and green. I caught a few bass, threw some back, and kept a couple for dinner. By late afternoon, I started looking for a good place to set up camp. That's when I saw it. The small aluminum boat wedged into the reeds along the riverbank. First, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people fished along the stretch, though I hadn't seen anyone all day. Maybe the owner had walked into the woods to relieve himself or stretch his legs. But as I paddled closer, I noticed little details that made my stomach tighten. The boat wasn't tied up. It was half drifted into the reeds, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. A fishing rod was propped against one side, the line still trailing into the water. An open tackle box sat near the bow, lures scattered as if knocked over. The cooler was cracked open, revealing a few melted ice packs and a half-empty water bottle. And then there was the fish. A single fish, gutted but not cleaned, lay on the seat. Its flesh was still pink, the cut fresh. Someone had been here not long ago. I drifted closer, my paddle dipping silently into the water. "Hello," I called, feeling ridiculous. The sound of my own voice startled me in the quiet. Nothing moved. No reply. I scanned the shoreline. Thick trees pressed close to the water's edge, their roots exposed where the river had worn away the earth. There was no sign of a trail, no footprints in the damp soil. If someone had gone into the woods, they hadn't left a mark. I considered pulling up alongside the boat, maybe checking the cooler for a name or a phone number. But something about the scene made my skin crawl. Felt wrong. I let the current carry me past, keeping an eye on the boat as I went. 100 yards downstream, I found a small, rocky shore where I could camp for the night. I pulled my canoe up, set up my tent, and tried to shake the unease that had settled over me. As the sun dipped below the trees, the forest came alive with the sounds of insects and distant night birds. I built a small fire, cooked the fish I had caught earlier, and ate in silence. The river was dark now, a smooth ribbon of black cutting through the wilderness. I couldn't stop thinking about that boat. The way it had been left, it wasn't just forgotten. It felt like someone had left in the middle of something. A fish half prepared, a rod still in the water. Who walks away from their boat without taking their gear? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Had there been an accident? Had someone fallen in? But if they had, wouldn't their body have drifted downstream? Or worse, had someone been watching me as I drifted past? I forced myself to shake it off. I had paddled miles from the boat. Whatever had happened there wasn't my problem. By the time I climbed into my tent, the fire had burned low. The night was silent except for the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface of the river. I closed my eyes, telling myself to sleep. A sound woke me, a slow, deliberate drip. At first, I thought it was just condensation rolling off the trees. But as I lay still, I realized it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the river. Drip, drip, like water falling from something solid. Something heavy. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned to embers, barely enough to light my small camp. The river was just beyond the edge of my vision, black and still. Then movement. A soft ripple spread across the surface, like something slipping into the water. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands and pointed it toward the river. Nothing. just the quiet lap of water against the shore. I told myself it was a fish, maybe a beaver, maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep much after that. The first light, I packed up. The feeling hadn't left me, and I didn't want to spend another night out there. I paddled back upriver, my muscles tight with exhaustion. When I reached the spot where I had seen the boat, I felt my stomach drop. It was gone, not stuck in the reeds, not drifting nearby, just gone. The fishing rod, the tackle box, the gutted fish vanished. I sat in my canoe, staring at the empty shoreline. Had someone come back for it? But why in the middle of the night? Or had it floated off on its own? A cold thought settled in my chest. The river had barely moved overnight. If it had simply drifted loose, it wouldn't have gone far. I turned my canoe in slow circles, scanning the water. A mile downstream, the river widened into a slow bend, and I spotted something near the far bank. A piece of aluminum, half submerged. I paddled closer, my breath shallow. It was the boat, upside down. There was no sign of the gear, no cooler, no rod. But as I got closer, I saw something tangled in the reeds. A single boot. It was wedged between the roots of a tree, the laces trailing like weeds in the current. It was empty. I didn't check for anything else. I turned my canoe and paddled harder than I ever had in my life, back upstream, back to my truck, back to civilization. I never reported what I saw. Maybe I should have. Maybe I don't want to know the answer. I had always loved fishing in remote places. Something about the silence, the isolation, and the slow rhythm of casting a line into the water gave me peace. So when my friend Mark suggested we rent a secluded cabin by a lake for a weekend of fishing, I didn't hesitate to say yes. The lake, called Black Hollow, was deep in the woods, far from any town. We had to drive down miles of dirt roads to get there. The cabin we rented was old but sturdy, a simple wooden structure with a small dock that stretched into the lake. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just us, our fishing gear, and the quiet expanse of water. As soon as we arrived, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange unease that settled in my stomach. I figured I was just adjusting to the isolation. We unpacked, set up our gear, and by late afternoon, we were on the dock, rods in hand, enjoying the stillness. That first night, we built a fire outside and sat by it, listening to the distant calls of owls and the occasional splash from the lake. The air was cold, and the only light came from our fire and the cabin's dim porch light. That's when I first noticed the scratches on the door. At first, I thought they were natural, just marks from old age or animals. But as I ran my fingers over them, I realized they weren't random. They were deep, deliberate, long scratches running from the bottom of the door to nearly the top. "Hey, Mark," I called. "Come look at this." He walked over, beer in hand, and squinted at the door. "What the hell? They look like claw marks." Mark laughed. "Maybe a bear?" I shook my head. "Too narrow, and they're straight, not like an animal swiping randomly." Mark shrugged. "Maybe someone messing around, or just years of wear and tear." I let it go. The scratches were old, and if they were important, someone would have warned us about them. We went back to the fire, and soon enough, I forgot about it. That night, the wind picked up. I woke up to the sound of branches tapping against the window. The cabin creaked as it settled in the cold. I was about to drift back to sleep when I heard it. A knock. Soft. Slow. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, heart pounding. It was 3 a.m, in the middle of nowhere. No one should be here. The knocking stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just the wind shifting the wood or some loose branch hitting the cabin. I forced myself to lie back down, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion took over. Morning came, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination. But when I stepped outside to grab firewood, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The dirt outside the door was disturbed. Fresh footprints circled the cabin.
Bare footprints.
They weren't animal tracks, not boot prints. They were human, and whoever they belonged to had walked around the entire cabin. I didn't tell Mark about the footprints. It sounded too crazy, and I didn't want to ruin our trip over something that might have a simple explanation. Maybe some local hunter or hiker had wandered by. Maybe I was overthinking it. We spent the day on the lake, fishing from the dock. The fish were biting, the sun was warm, and for a while, I forgot about the night before. Then, just as the sun started dipping behind the trees, I saw something in the water. A figure. It was on the opposite shore, standing in the shallow water, facing our side of the lake. At first, I thought it was just a tree stump or a shadow, but then it moved. "Mark," I whispered. He looked up from his tackle box. "What?" I pointed. "Over there." He squinted. "I don't see anything." I looked back. The figure was gone. I swallowed hard. Maybe it had just been my imagination. The light was changing. Shadows were playing tricks on the water. That had to be it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. At some point, I heard movement outside, soft, slow footsteps on the wooden porch. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my pocket knife under the blanket. Then the knocking came again. This time it was louder. Knock, knock, knock. Mark woke up. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. "Stay quiet." The knocking stopped. Then we heard something else. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing just outside the window. Mark grabbed his flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it at the window. The second the light hit the glass, the breathing stopped. We didn't sleep after that. By morning, I had made up my mind. "We're leaving," I said. Mark didn't argue. He looked just as shaken as I felt. We packed up as fast as we could and loaded the truck. As I went back for the last of our gear, I glanced at the door one last time. The scratches, they were deeper now. I hadn't noticed them this morning, but now they looked fresh, like someone, or something, had been clawing at the door while we slept. We didn't look back as we drove away. I never went back to Black Hollow. I've been fishing this river for years. It's one of those spots you find by accident, down a long, rutted dirt road that barely gets used. The kind of place that doesn't show up on maps. The river runs slow here, winding through thick forests with nothing but the sound of water and the occasional call of birds. I always fished alone. No distractions, no noise, just me, my rod, and the river. That day was no different. I parked my truck in the usual spot, grabbed my gear, and made the short hike through the trees to the riverbank. The path was familiar, narrow, overgrown, but well-worn from my own boots over the years. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees. Perfect time for fishing. As I stepped onto the bank, something caught my eye. Footprints in the mud. At first, I figured they were mine from a few days ago, but they were too fresh, too defined. Someone had been here recently. The thing was, there were only prints leading toward the river, none leading away. I looked around, scanning the area, but saw nothing. The woods were still, quiet, untouched. I brushed it off. Maybe someone passed through and waded into the water. Or maybe the return tracks were just washed away. Either way, it wasn't enough to make me leave. I set up my rod, cast my line, and settled into my usual routine. The river was calm, the occasional ripple breaking the surface. Minutes turned into an hour. The feeling of being watched crept up on me slowly. It wasn't the usual unease you get from being alone in the woods. This was different. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, but there was nothing. Then the sounds changed. If you spend enough time outdoors, you learn to listen. You know when the woods are normal. Birds calling, leaves rustling, distant creaks of branches. And you know when something's off. The silence was wrong. Too complete. No wind.
No insects.
Just stillness. I tried to shake it off, but my hands felt clammy. The air seemed heavier. I kept my focus on the water, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate exhale. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was human. Close. Behind me, my body locked up. I didn't turn around immediately. I just sat there, gripping my rod, every muscle tensed. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a hiker, a hunter, someone else who found this place and didn't expect company. I forced myself to turn. Nothing. The trees stood motionless, the undergrowth undisturbed. No footprints, no shifting branches, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I scanned the tree line, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't armed, just a small knife in my tackle box, barely useful for anything but cutting line. I stayed seated, listening. If someone was watching me, they were good at staying hidden. A twig snapped. This time, I stood up fast, scanning the woods, trying to pinpoint the sound. It came from deeper in the trees. I took a slow step back toward the water. Then I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, just movement. A shadow shifting between the trees, too fast to make out details. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my tackle box and rod, backing toward the path. My truck was a 5-minute walk away. I could make it in 2 if I ran. Then I saw the footprints again. The ones leading to the river. They were gone. The mud was smooth, undisturbed, like no one had ever been there. But I had seen them. I knew they were there. That was enough for me. I turned and walked fast, not running, not yet. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing in from all sides. The path felt longer, the trees denser. Then, from behind me, another sound. A whisper. Not words, just the sound of breath, close enough that I should have felt it on my neck. That's when I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I yanked the door open, threw my gear inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. As I backed up, my headlights swept across the trees. For a second, just a split second, I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, tall, still, watching. Then they were gone. I drove faster than I ever had on that road, tires kicking up gravel. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that river. I've been ice fishing since I was a kid, long enough to know the risks. My dad used to take me out on the lake every winter, teaching me how to check the thickness of the ice, how to drill an auger hole without cracking the surface, how to listen for the deep groans that meant the lake was shifting beneath me. I never took chances, not when I was alone. That's why, when I decided to go ice fishing by myself that day, I made sure everything was perfect. The weather had been cold for weeks, a deep freeze that locked the entire lake under a thick layer of ice. The local fishing forums said the ice was over 12 inches thick. Plenty safe. I packed my gear, dressed in my warmest layers, and drove out before dawn. By the time I reached the lake, the sun had just started to rise. The parking area was empty. Most guys didn't fish this early, especially not on a weekday, but I preferred the solitude. I liked being the only one out there. Nothing but the ice, the wind, and the stillness of the lake. I parked near the shoreline, stepped out of my truck, and pulled my sled from the bed. It held everything I needed: my auger, my folding chair, my small pop-up shelter, and a thermos of hot coffee. My breath hung in the air as I surveyed the ice. The lake was a sheet of white, stretching for miles, smooth except for a few wind-blown drifts. I took my ice chisel and walked carefully onto the surface, striking down every few steps to test the ice. It was solid.
No cracks, no slashes.
Perfect conditions. I pulled my sled behind me, walking out toward the center of the lake. A few hundred yards from shore, I found my spot, a place I'd fished before, where the water dropped off into deeper channels. I set my sled down, took a deep breath of the cold air, and started drilling. The auger bit into the ice with a familiar crunch, spiraling down into the frozen lake. After a minute, water started pooling in the hole, clear and cold. I dropped my line in and set up my chair. Then I waited. The silence out there was absolute. No birds, no whine through the trees, nothing. Just the occasional deep creak of the ice shifting far beneath me, a sound I'd heard 100 times before. The first fish hit my line about 20 minutes in. A small perch, nothing worth keeping, but the tug of the fight sent a thrill through me. I released it and kept fishing. An hour passed, then two. The sun hung low in the sky, struggling against the thick winter clouds. I took a sip of my coffee, now lukewarm, and glanced toward the shoreline. My truck was a tiny speck in the distance. I was alone. That was when I heard the first sound. A crunch. Not the deep groaning of ice shifting. Not the normal settling sounds of a frozen lake. A footstep. I froze, my body going rigid. I turned my head slowly, scanning the ice around me. Nothing. I let out a slow breath. Maybe the ice had just cracked somewhere further down the lake. That happened sometimes. Shifts in pressure could send sounds echoing for miles. I went back to fishing. Another hour passed. The temperature was dropping. The wind had picked up slightly, whistling across the ice. I adjusted my scarf and checked my watch. I'd give it another 30 minutes before packing up. Then I heard it again. A distinct, deliberate crunch. Closer this time. I spun around, my heart hammering. The ice stretched empty in all directions. No movement, no tracks, just the smooth, untouched surface of the lake. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the unease creeping up my spine. It had to be the ice. Maybe a shift in the temperature was making it settle more aggressively. Still, I suddenly felt very aware of how alone I was. I pulled my auger from where it lay beside me and stood up, gripping the handle tightly. I scanned the ice again. Nothing. Shaking my head, I told myself I was just being jumpy. I'd been out here for hours. The cold was getting to me. I decided to call it a day. I reached down to grab my rod when I heard it again. Closer. A single, slow step. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head as slowly as I could, scanning the ice. Empty. The wind had died completely. The lake was still, the air thick with silence. My gut told me to leave. I reached for my sled, gripping the handle tightly, and started walking toward shore. My boots crunched on the ice, each step too loud in the dead quiet. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Not an echo, a second set of steps, matching my pace. I stopped. The sound stopped. I turned. Nothing. The ice was smooth and undisturbed. No tracks, no movement. Just my sled, my chair, my auger. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I wasn't imagining this. I gritted my teeth and started walking again. Faster this time. The footsteps followed. Faster. I broke into a run. The sled bounced behind me as I sprinted for shore, my breath coming in quick, sharp gasps. The ice groaned beneath my feet. Then my auger, still lying on the ice, slid 3 feet on its own. I stopped. My chest heaved. I stared at it. It had been lying flat. No wind, no movement, just smooth ice. And yet it had moved. Something was here. I didn't grab my sled. I didn't grab anything. I ran. The ice cracked under my feet as I tore across the lake, my legs burning, breath steaming in the freezing air. The shore felt impossibly far. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, right behind me. I hit the shoreline hard, nearly falling as I reached my truck. My hands fumbled with the door handle, fingers numb and shaking. I yanked it open, threw myself inside, and slammed the lock down. For a moment, I just sat there, gasping, staring at the lake. The ice was still. My sled, my gear, everything was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing moved. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally started the truck. I never went back for my gear. Let the ice keep it. I was never the superstitious type. Sure, I enjoyed listening to old stories, but I never let them dictate my life. I grew up fishing in rivers and lakes across my home state, and nothing about a patch of water ever made me nervous. That changed one late summer afternoon when I made the mistake of dismissing an old man's warning. It was a Saturday in early September. The weather was warm, the sky clear, and the air carried that crisp, late-season scent, somewhere between summer and fall. I had my fishing gear packed, a cooler full of drinks, and my favorite folding chair strapped to my back. My plan was simple. Spend the afternoon at the local reservoir, cast a few lines, and enjoy the quiet before life got busy again. The reservoir was a place I had been to many times before, but that day I decided to try a new spot. Instead of setting up near the well-worn banks where families usually fished, I took a side trail leading to a more secluded section. The ground was a mix of hard-packed dirt and scattered rocks, and a few fallen trees lined the shore. The water here was deeper and darker than the rest of the reservoir. It had a stillness to it, a kind of eerie calm. As I reached the clearing, an older man stood a few yards away, staring at the water. He had one of those weathered faces, the kind that looked like it had seen too many harsh summers and unforgiving winters. His fishing rod rested on a stand, untouched. I nodded in greeting, expecting the usual small talk between fishermen, but he didn't respond. After a few moments, he finally spoke. "Be careful. That spot takes people." I stopped unpacking my gear and glanced at him. "Sorry, what?" He turned slightly, his eyes still on the water. "That spot you're setting up in. It's taken people before." I let out a short chuckle, thinking it was some kind of joke. "You mean like people drowning?" The old man didn't laugh. "Drowning, disappearances. A few kids over the years. A couple of grown men, too." I should have taken his words more seriously, but I brushed it off as local superstition. Every lake, every river, every fishing hole had its fair share of stories. It was just something people said to keep kids from doing something stupid. "Well, I appreciate the warning," I said, setting my chair down, "but I'll be fine." He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head and started reeling in his untouched line. Without another word, he packed up and walked off, leaving me alone at the water's edge. I shrugged it off, cast my line, and settled into my chair. The reservoir stretched wide and still before me, the surface reflecting the sky like glass. It was the perfect day for fishing. For about an hour, nothing happened. My bobber barely moved. I switched bait, adjusted my cast, and tried again. A little while later, my line tugged hard. I sat forward, gripping my rod. Whatever I had hooked was heavy, too heavy for a fish. It wasn't fighting, just dragging against my line like dead weight. I figured I had snagged a sunken log, but as I pulled, it shifted, as if something beneath the water was slowly rising. Then I saw it. A single, bloated shoe broke the surface, tangled in weeds and fishing line. At first, my brain didn't register it. It looked old and worn, half rotted by water and time. But then, as I pulled a little more, something came with it. A shape beneath the surface. My stomach twisted. I let go of the reel, letting the line go slack. The shoe, along with whatever was attached to it, slowly sank back into the darkness. My breathing was shallow. My hands trembled. I didn't want to believe what I had just seen. A shoe, and beyond it, something pale, something still. I sat frozen for a long while. My first thought was that it had to be a trick of the light. Maybe an old boot someone had tossed in. Maybe a bundle of rotted clothes. But deep down, I knew better. I cut the line and stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. A creeping unease settled in, like the air had gotten heavier. The trees behind me felt taller, the silence louder. I decided I had fished enough for the day. As I gathered my gear, I heard footsteps on the dirt path behind me. Turning, I saw the old man again, standing at the treeline, watching. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. I hesitated. I don't know what I saw." The old man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "You should leave." I didn't need convincing. I slung my bag over my shoulder and started walking. The old man followed a few paces behind, quiet. When we reached the main path, he finally spoke again. "They never find them, you know?" I stopped. "Who?" "The ones that go in." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was just spinning some old fisherman's tale. But my mind kept going back to that pale, unmoving shape beneath the water. "Don't go back there," the old man said. "Some places ain't meant to be fished." I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shoe, the weeds wrapped around it, the pale thing lurking just beneath the surface. The next morning, I checked the news, half expecting to see a report about a body found in the reservoir. Nothing. No missing person reports, no police activity. For a while, I thought about calling it in, telling someone, but what would I say? That I hooked something weird while fishing? That I saw a shape that might have been human? I knew how it would sound, so I said nothing. I never went back to that spot. I never even fished the reservoir again. But every now and then, when the air is still and the water is dark, I think about that old man's words. That spot takes people. Fishing had always been my escape. The quiet ripple of water, the feel of the rod in my hands, the occasional thrill of a good catch. It all kept me coming back. That weekend, I drove 2 hours out to a remote river in the woods, a place I'd only fished a handful of times. It wasn't popular, which was exactly why I liked it. Fewer people, fewer distractions. I arrived late in the afternoon, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The river was slow-moving, its surface dark and glassy beneath the overcast sky. The banks were lined with trees, their twisted roots exposed in places where the water had eroded the soil. I found a decent spot along a narrow bend, where the water deepened and curled around a fallen tree, creating an eddy. Fish like to gather in spots like this. After setting up my gear, I cast my line and settled in. The silence out here was different from what I was used to back home. There was no distant hum of traffic, no voices carrying over from nearby houses, just the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. The first hour passed uneventfully. I caught a few small fish, nothing worth keeping. It didn't bother me. Fishing wasn't just about the catch. It was about the patience, the quiet. But then, as I was preparing to cast again, my line suddenly went taut. It wasn't the usual jerk of a fish hitting the bait. This was heavy, solid, like I'd snagged a submerged log. I gave the line a few experimental tugs. Whatever it was, it didn't move. I sighed, thinking I'd have to cut the line. But then, just as I was reaching for my pocket knife, the resistance shifted. I froze. Logs didn't move. A slow, dragging sensation traveled through the line, as if whatever I'd hooked was being pulled along by the current. But the water wasn't moving that fast. My pulse quickened as I tightened my grip and reeled in carefully. The weight remained consistent, too steady for a fish, too unnatural for a snag. Then something surfaced. Plastic bag. I barely breathed as it bobbed in the water, caught on my line. It was bloated, tied off at the top, the kind of heavy-duty trash bag people used for yard waste or moving. The black plastic was stretched tight, bulging as if whatever was inside had been trapped for a while. I stared at it, my hands clenched around the rod. My first instinct was to let it go. Just cut the line and forget about it. But something about it gnawed at me. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the gnawing sense that I just stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. I started reeling it in. The bag drifted closer, bumping gently against a cluster of submerged branches near the shore. My stomach twisted as I noticed the discoloration in the water around it. A faint, sickly brown tint that leaked from the bag's base. I dropped my rod. The bag had torn slightly where it had caught on the branches, and something pale was visible through the gap. A shape, a color that didn't belong. I swallowed hard, stepping back. The air suddenly felt too thick, the quiet around me pressing in. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it was just an animal, someone dumping a deer carcass after hunting. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't an animal. My hands felt numb as I reached for my pocket knife and cut the line. The bag drifted, caught for a moment against the branches before slipping free and floating slowly back into the current. It should have been over. I should have packed up and left. But I didn't. I stood there, watching the bag bob downstream, disappearing around the bend. My legs felt heavy, rooted in place. Something inside me kept saying, "You need to go after it. You need to see." I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I found myself walking along the bank, following the bag's slow journey downriver. The terrain was rough, the soil damp and loose beneath my boots. I moved carefully, keeping the bag in sight. The farther I walked, the more I regretted it. The trees grew denser here, their twisted limbs forming a canopy that swallowed the daylight. The air was different, thick with the scent of rot and stagnant water. Then I saw it. The bag had snagged again, this time on a low-hanging tree root that jutted out over a shallow pool at the river's edge. I hesitated. This was my last chance to turn back. Whatever was in that bag, I didn't want to know. But some part of me, the same part that had kept me from cutting the line right away, couldn't walk away. I stepped closer. The water around the bag was still, except for the slow, eerie movement of the current tugging at the plastic. The closer I got, the worse the smell became, an acrid, cloying stench that made my stomach churn. I swallowed hard and reached out, using the tip of my knife to pull at the torn plastic. The bag opened. I stumbled back so fast I nearly slipped into the water. A hand, bloated, discolored, fingers swollen and stiff. The nails were cracked, one missing entirely, leaving behind a dark, jagged wound. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my stomach lurch. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran. My boots slipped on the damp soil, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred around me as I stumbled back toward my truck, my mind screaming at me to move faster. I didn't stop until I reached my vehicle, yanking the door open and shoving the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out onto the dirt road, gravel kicking up behind me. I drove until I reached the nearest town, my pulse still hammering in my ears. First, I didn't know what to do. Who was I supposed to call? What was I supposed to say? Hey, I was fishing and found a body in the river, but I cut it loose and ran? Eventually, I forced myself to call the authorities. They asked me questions, too many all blending together. They wanted to know the exact location, the description of the bag, every little detail I could remember. I told them what I could, my voice hollow. They sent a team out to investigate, but when they searched the river, they found nothing.
No bag.
No body. No sign that anything had ever been there. They didn't say it outright, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Maybe they thought I mistook an animal carcass for something worse. Maybe they thought I was making it up. Couldn't blame them, but I knew what I saw. For weeks, I kept checking the news, expecting to hear something. Body found in river, investigation underway. But there was nothing. Eventually, I stopped looking. I stopped fishing alone after that. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew the truth. Somewhere, that bag was still out there. And whoever had put it there, they were still out there too. I've always enjoyed fishing in solitude. There's something about being out in nature, away from the noise of the world, that feels right, clears my mind, resets me. I never liked crowded piers or popular lakes. I wanted quiet, untouched spots, places where I could cast my line and listen only to the sound of the water moving, the birds calling, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. That's how I found Ledgewater Bluff. It wasn't well known. In fact, I only heard about it from an older man at a bait shop who mentioned it in passing. "Nobody goes there," he had said while scooping up a handful of worms into a styrofoam cup.
Steep cliff, rough terrain.
Hard to get down to the water, but if you're willing to work for it, the fish there are big. That was enough to convince me. The next weekend, I packed up my gear, just the essentials, and drove 2 hours to the location. There was no marked trail, no parking lot, just an unpaved pull-off on the side of a quiet, cracked road. A narrow path, barely visible, led through dense trees toward the bluffs. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I made my way down. I wasn't worried about the descent. I'd hiked tougher trails before, but he hadn't been lying. It was steep. The path was littered with loose rocks, and at one point, I had to grip onto an exposed root to keep from slipping. After about 20 minutes of carefully making my way downward, the trees thinned out, and I reached the rocky outcrop that overlooked the lake. And it was beautiful. The water stretched out wide, deep blue, with sheer cliffs wrapping around its edges. I saw no houses, no boats, no other people, just stillness. It was exactly what I had been looking for. I set my gear down near the edge, secured my footing, and cast my line. For the first hour, everything was normal, peaceful. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. I lost track of time, focused entirely on the slow rhythm of casting, waiting, and reeling. Then I saw him, down below, near the base of the cliff, standing ankle-deep in the water. A man. At first, I thought he was another fisherman. Maybe he had found a way down to the shoreline that I hadn't seen. But as I watched him, something felt off. He wasn't fishing. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, facing the water, completely still. I felt a chill creep up my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. He was about 50 feet below me, close enough that I could make out his shape but not his face. He wore dark pants and a long-sleeved shirt, both soaked from the knees down. His posture was rigid, unnatural, like he had been placed there rather than having walked in. Cleared my throat. "Hey!" No reaction. I hesitated, then tried again, louder this time. "You all right down there?" Still nothing. I frowned, gripping my fishing rod tighter. Maybe he hadn't heard me, or maybe he was in some kind of shock. The lake was remote. If he had fallen or hurt himself, he might need help. I stepped closer to the edge, raising a hand to wave. "Hey, man, you need help." And then he turned his head. Not his body, just his head. It was slow, unnatural, like something out of a bad dream. And as he turned, I finally saw his face. Except I didn't, because there wasn't one. The details were blurred, featureless, as if water had washed them away. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a human head. I took a step back, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. He was looking at me, or at least I think he was. Then, just as slowly, he turned his head back toward the water. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. I wanted to believe it was some trick of the light, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I had seen it, and when I looked down again, he was gone. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, staring at the empty shoreline, trying to convince myself of what I had just seen. Had he gone under the water? No, I would have seen the ripples. Had he walked away? Impossible, I would have heard movement on the rocks. And yet, he had vanished. A deep, unsettling feeling settled in my gut. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to pack up my gear and get back to my car as fast as possible. But instead, I made a mistake. I decided to go down there. I needed to know if there were footprints, if there were any signs that he had been real. The descent wasn't easy. The cliffside was steep, the rocks loose beneath my boots. I had to lower myself carefully, using my hands for balance. With every step, my pulse pounded harder in my chest. When I finally reached the bottom, the shoreline was eerily silent. The water lapped gently against the rocks, undisturbed. I scanned the area where he had been standing.
No footprints.
No sign of movement. Nothing. But then, something floated past me in the water. A single soaked shoe. That was it. That was all I needed. I turned and scrambled back up the rocks, moving faster than I ever had before. I didn't care about safety anymore. I just needed to get out. My fingers scraped against sharp stone. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I reached the top, grabbed my gear, and bolted for the tree line. I didn't look back. The whole hike back to my car felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. My skin crawled with the feeling of being watched. My breathing was ragged, my muscles tense, expecting someone, to grab me from behind. But nothing did. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to get the keys into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I floored it, kicking up gravel as I sped away from that place. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to Ledgewater Bluff. I don't fish alone anymore either. For weeks after that day, I had nightmares. Nightmares of standing at the cliffside, looking down, and seeing him there again, staring up at me with that blank, empty face. Sometimes I still dream about it. And in those dreams, when I turn away from the water, he's standing right behind me,